sometimes people say, well, why should I bother planning? Because there's so many fires that need to be fought that, maybe I make a plan and then my plan never goes as planned. And following the plan exactly is not actually the point of the plan, right? The plan is there to help make sure that we're spending our precious resource of time on the things that are going to move the needle, right? So that if you have a plan and you say, these are the things I really need to get done today, these are the most important things. If there's incoming items or busy work or your email inbox or whatever, now you can evaluate that against the plan. You can say, oh, is this thing worthy of shifting my plan?
Business can be stressful, especially if you want to achieve great things, which is why most people choose to start their own business. And that's the subject of today's chapter on the business library, how to actually deal with stress management. That's why I have Alexis on here. Just before we get into that, of course, we have our free courses linked down below. That's the sponsor of this episode, both on content marketing and also how to get started in investing. But to start us off talking about today's subject, what are some of the reasons people end up getting stressed?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I'm happy to talk about this issue because it's something that plagues most people, and
Yeah.
certainly entrepreneurs. And so I think that for the grand majority of people, especially those that I work with, the stress comes from two things. One, feeling as though that they somehow are going to be able to get everything done if they can just figure out the right way to do it together. If they can just Tetris it together, they must be doing something wrong because they can't get it all done. So there's one side of it. And then the other side of it is there is actually too much to do. So these things are kind of at odds with each other, because the reality is that you, me, and every other entrepreneur and or person on the planet could work 18 hours a day for the rest of our lives, and there would still be more work tomorrow, right? The work never
Yeah.
ends. And so I think that there is that a lot of the stress comes from thinking that somehow there is a way to do it all and we're just not doing it right, right? Instead of really understanding that life, business, it's all about choices. It's about trade-offs. And because it is just true that we can't do it all, we need to first accept what we can and cannot do and make decisions that we can feel good about, so that we can feel good about what we're doing and what we're not doing.
Hmm. I really like that approach, I must say. Yeah, because I am starting to realize that you can't do everything. Like
No.
everything that comes into the to-do list or the to-what list or whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
uh, it's not everything. You definitely have to prioritize.
Right.
Um,
Right. And it wouldn't be a very interesting otherwise, right? If we all lived in a world where every day we just, we got done all the things that needed to get done, we'd never be striving for anything, never making interesting choices. I don't think that's actually a world we want either.
and there's definitely some part of like the pressure makes diamonds. I think is true for humans as well. It's
Mhm.
healthy to get into that zone where you get stressed out if it's manageable and
Well,
if
I
it's
think
done in like small stages.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up something really valid, which is that we tend to think about stress as like a bad word, right?
Yeah.
And that's not true. There is also what's called EU stress, right? Which is like stress that is actually good and pushes us forward and causes us to to the pressure that makes the diamonds, that causes us to do things well, right? And it's that we need to balance those two types of stress, and that we need to really think about, like, how do we not go over the edge, right? Because a lot of times when people are thinking about stress, what they're actually talking about is burnout. And that is kind of stress taken to the nth degree. Because I think you're right. Like, a little bit of stress is not a bad thing. We all know people who really thrive on a deadline.
Yeah. And at least in my experience, all humans gets more done with a deadline. Um, how far ahead of the deadline they get it done, that's different. But you mentioning EU stress, not something I've heard about
Mhm.
before,
Yeah.
wanted me to ask, like, how do we differentiate between the two?
Yeah. Well, I think that it can, I mean, it's hard to be like, well, this is this particular type of stress. But I think that when you feel some kind of stress or pressure, and that is driving you to finish the work, do the work, get things done. And when you do, you feel good and accomplished. I think that we can say like that wasn't bad toxic stress, right? It's the other side of things where when you're feeling like the stress is all you can feel, when you're edging towards burnout and you're kind of losing your sense of meaning of why you're doing the work you're doing or you're doing the things that you're doing, when you're so tired that you don't have time for anything else, when you start to feel that your relationships are atrophying, your health is atrophying, that kind of stress, that's not stress that is good for us, right? And so I think it's not so easy to be like, here's how we cultivate this one and here's how we cultivate this one. But I think that we can kind of notice the difference of when something is more of a positive force and when something is so stressful that it is actually a negative force on our life. Like I'm coming up with this analogy as I'm thinking right now, so I don't know if this is going to play out well, but I think about it kind of like substances and addiction and things like that, right? It's like if you're somebody who drinks a glass of wine every day and that's not a problem in your life in any way, then it's not a problem. If you're someone who drinks a glass of wine every day, but that's all you can think about, right? You get through your whole day and all you're thinking about is when you can get that glass of wine or bottle of vodka or whatever it is, right? Then that's probably not very healthy, right? And so it's the same behaviors maybe, but it's being manifested in a different way. So I think about it as if the stress is something that is not causing really negative effects in your life, then it's probably not that bad. And if the stress is really detrimental to you being fulfilled in your life, then that's something that we want to work on.
It's very, very funny balancing act sometimes.
Very funny what?
A very funny balancing act between what's good and what's not. I like the analogy of the wine because it kind of takes it into a scenario where everybody can understand. And also, like that you pointed out, really depends on where it comes from. Like, where does it stem from? And the moderation, I think, is another thing that it comes into. Like, it that takes over your life, even if it's just that 1 glass or 10 glasses. But if that's all you think about, then you're like over moderating it. Then it's not healthy. I like that a lot.
Right. Yeah.
And when people are sitting, they're most likely watching this video because they do feel tressed out. That's probably why they clicked on this podcast. It would make a lot of sense, at least.
True.
So, what would you recommend for the person watching because they're stressed out to start managing it?
Yeah. So I think that one of the first things that we can do is actually to start writing things down in one place and to start getting things out of our head. And this is very simple. This is a very simple technique, but so often, I mean, I work with people who I would say are very successful people who are also incredibly stressed out, verging on burnout, have become successful through like brute force, right? And are now looking to continue to maintain their success, but not in such a stressful way. And one of the things that I find with almost everybody is that their to-do list is living in their head. Or maybe not all of it, but there is a significant amount of stuff that is just in their head. And when stuff is in your head, it is actually very hard to make progress on because you're ping-ponging around, right? You are not able to do kind of one thing at a time, move through it. You typically tend to think that you're going to be able to do more things than you can. We typically also have a kind of ball of anxiety sitting in the back of our brain that says to us, like, I know I'm going to forget something. I just don't know what it is or when it's going to come back to bite me, right? And so I think that the first step is actually to do what we call a brain dump and literally just dump all of the thoughts that you're thinking into something, right? So whether that's a task app, whether that's a document, whether that's a piece of paper, it doesn't really matter at that point. But what we want to do is we want to give value to that stuff. We want to say, okay, it's stuff you have to do. It's stuff you think you have to do. It's stuff you might have to do. It's all the open questions that are sitting there in your brain. It's the fears, it's the worries, it's the whatever. It becomes a lot more manageable when it gets out of your head. And then of course, that's not the only step, but I think that's a really good first step.
Yeah. I like that again a lot. And I started laughing a little bit when you said one
Hmm.
place, because I'm definitely the person. I have a few places. I'm starting
Yeah.
to get better at just having one place. I just have a couple of like chats with
Yeah.
myself, because then
Yeah.
I can transfer things from my PC and
Yeah.
my phone, and I don't have to do an extra step. It's
Yep.
just there. And I, I had a bunch of notes in my notes app, and then once I had to transfer them to my PC, a couple of times ended up clicking delete instead of copy,
Oh
and
no. Yeah.
that annoyed me a lot. So I was like, yeah, let's
Right.
get around that.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think that so it's like you would not be the only person that is keeping things in a lot of different places. Right. And I think that what you've probably noticed with that is one, there's like transferring that needs to happen. And most people, let's face it, aren't doing any of the transferring. So that means that now when you think you're like, I know I wrote this down somewhere, where, right? And we're like searching in different places. And it's also harder to prioritize because you're going back and forth between these different places. And the reality is that humans can't multitask, or rather, the studies show that 2.5% of humans are capable of multitasking, and 97.5% of humans are not capable of multitasking. And so we think that we can like just store this stuff and do all this stuff. In reality, we can't. It tanks our productivity. It makes us more stressed. And so, I like to use, I use a task app that is also a notes app, and it syncs everywhere, right? So it's on my computer. It's also on my phone. My computer is a Mac. My phone is an Android. Doesn't matter. It syncs all between them. I can add things by voice. It syncs up to Google Home and Google and Amazon Alexa. So like, there's a lot of ways that I can be anywhere and I can still get stuff all into the same place.
Yeah, Alexis
Yeah.
must be annoying with your name.
What? Oh yes, we
Alex.
don't call ours that. We have renamed it.
That would cause some problems. And it was funny you
Yes.
mentioned like transferring notes, because sometimes I
Yeah.
write notes in small notepads, and here is some notes
Yeah.
that I have forgotten to transfer so far today.
Yeah.
So yes,
Well,
definitely, yeah.
and sometimes it's like sometimes people I will say I'm going to show you I am a paper notes person, like especially because I'm often in client sessions with people. I am often taking notes on paper in front of me, and I have to transfer these like I transfer them at the end of every session if I can. And I just have a hard and fast rule that by the end of the day, anything that is in this notebook gets transferred into my system. And there are a lot of easy ways we can do that. There are so many great ways now. You can like take a picture, and Google Keep will pull out it'll OCR the text for you. You can just copy and paste the text. Like there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. But I find like I wish I was a person that just really loved taking notes digitally. But I've tried every type of digital note-taking system, and I think it's great for a place of record. And I still default to having paper notes in front of me. So that transferring process is incredibly important if we're going to do that.
All right. I'm even more weird. I prefer either paper or my phone. I can't do notes on my PC. I can
Okay.
happily sit and do notes, and just because I can
Yeah.
go somewhere else with my phone, then I can do notes on it.
Yeah.
I can't sit in front of my PC doing notes.
And do
It
it.
doesn't
Yeah.
work. I get
Yeah.
nothing done. That's not a place to transfer notes and do all of
It
that
doesn't work
stuff.
for you. Yeah.
Not at all.
Yeah. And I love that you know that about yourself, because I think that's what's really key about a lot of this stuff is like you and I are going to be different, and we're going to be different from every single person that's listening here. And so it's really about finding the processes and the practices that work for you and knowing that about yourself, right?
For sure. And one reason why I also think it's important to like transfer notes is you remove the distraction in your head.
Mm-hmm.
Because like if you think of something, you're
Yep.
gonna make sure you don't forget it. So you're not gonna allow anything really new to come
Yeah.
into your brain, and your focus is just there. Your
Right.
focus, your attention, like that's on that specific matter. You don't allow your brain to really open up. You write it down, then you can go on to the next thing and think that through.
Right, exactly. It comes. I don't know if you've read David Allen's book, Getting Things Done.
No,
It's his book
actually not.
It's like I don't know. It's a book that he wrote like maybe 30 years ago or so. There, I will say like there's a lot of great nuggets in there. It's not something that I don't consider it a Bible or anything, but it's like, there's a lot of great things in there. But he says one thing that really succinctly puts what you just shared, which is your mind is for having ideas, not for holding them.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not the best at
It's
all.
not that it doesn't work, right?
Your
It's
PC does that way better, or your phone.
Right.
Piece of
Because
paper.
yeah, exactly. And I think this is like the exact thing that's happening when we try to keep stuff up here is our brain is working so hard to juggle all of the things that we don't want to forget that it leaves us with almost no brain power to focus on the thing we're actually trying to do.
And even though it's very powerful, there is a limited amount of power our brain has.
Yeah.
And it's a good testing those boundaries. You kind of alluded a little bit to that. What's a healthy way, in your eyes, to actually go out, test the boundaries so you can keep growing without suffering burnout?
So I think I'm a really big believer in experimentation and iteration, right? So we want to be saying like, oh, I read about this. I think a lot of times it's like, oh, we read about some strategy somewhere, right? Well,
Yeah.
we want to test it out. And I would say like, try it for like, make a concerted effort to test something out for a week or two, right? And then ask yourself, what worked well about that? What didn't work very well about that? How could I tweak it? Is there anything I could do to iterate this to make it work better for me? Right. And so I'll give you an example that comes up a lot in my work, which is around another way I find that we can really reduce stress and increase productivity at the same time is by engaging in a little bit of kind of end of week planning and end of day planning so that we can one, mentally disconnect from our work in the evenings or the weekends. And that two, when we start the next day, we have a plan to work from, right? We're not starting from scratch. We're not sitting there saying, what should I do next? What should I do first? Right. And when I work with clients around this, we call it end of day planning. It doesn't necessarily have to be done at the very end of the day, right? And so they might try it for a week and they'll try it to do it the last thing they do in the day. And some that works for some people or the last part of the workday. And that works well for some people. And for other people, they're like, oh, like I just always prioritize that one last email and I just don't do this. And so then we say, okay, great. Like, what could we tweak about it? Right. And maybe we'll say, okay, let's tie it to your last meeting of the day. At the end of your last meeting of the day, you'll do like 5-10 minutes of planning for the next day. Right. And that works well for some people. Or some people are like, man, that still doesn't work for me. And so we'll say, what about like just after lunch? Right. What if you did a little plan? Because usually after lunch, we kind of have a pretty good idea about what we're going to accomplish for the rest of the day. So what if we do it then? And we just kind of keep iterating on it until it is something that works. Right. And so that's what I would say to folks is like, we don't want to try a million things at once and try to do them, quote, perfectly, because that doesn't exist. Like whoever came up with that technique, it worked for them. It doesn't mean it's going to work exactly the same for you. And so I think that so many people kind of throw in the towel and give up before really committing to just iterating on something to figure out how it does work for them.
I love that you pointed out in there that it depends on the individual.
Yeah.
All advice is really situational. At least if
Yes.
it's really, really, really good advice, then it's situational. You can get good advice and okay advice that can be general.
Right.
Best advice you hit.
Right. And it's situational kind of from an environmental perspective, but it's also situational because we are all different people, right? And what works for you may not work for me. And we have different ways of going about things. And I think that's something that's really important for people to kind of internalize, because if you go out there and you read the books about stress and productivity and all of this stuff, and you try to implement that exactly and you fail, you will feel like it is you that is the problem instead of the fact that this thing just wasn't written exactly for you and your situation. Like if you take, Cal Newport, Deep Work, he wrote the book Deep Work, right? There are some really amazing ideas in that book, but he's also a professor who can have long stretches of time where he doesn't need to be in contact with other people, right? And like they aren't messaging him. If you are a manager of a team of 25 tech leaders, you are probably going to need to be more accessible than he would be,
Yeah.
right?
I hope you are.
Right, exactly. And so it doesn't mean that you can't, as a manager of a big team of tech leaders, it doesn't mean that you can't have times in the day where you are deeply focused and you don't have notifications on and things like that. But they're not going to be probably all day. It might be an hour here or 2 hours there, et cetera. And so I think that being more flexible with the approaches we take helps us to tailor them to who we are, which is more sustainable in the long term.
Yeah. And yeah, just keep adjusting, analyzing what you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
as you went in onto as well.
Yeah.
And I was sitting one day and I was looking at all the successful people that I follow, and one thing clicked in my head and was like, none of these people are saying the same thing. Like some
Right.
of the things, of course, contradict and go, but some of the things also completely contradict each other.
Oh,
This guy
totally.
said
Right.
this guy, and they are not
Right.
agreeing, but they're both
Yeah.
equally as successful. So clearly, it's not just one path; it depends on the
Right.
person. And then I started to like take one thing here, take one thing here,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll start mixing them together and then trying them out as you spoke about. Um,
Yeah.
and reaching a lot of people and doing a lot leads me into another question,
Mm-hmm.
because I read on your LinkedIn that you teach 113,000 people. How do you go
Hmm.
about that? That's a
Oh,
lot of
well,
fucking people.
I actually should update that because I think it's actually 183,000 as of yesterday. So a lot of that is through my online courses, right? So I've had many, many, many people that about 183,000 people have taken my online courses. And then, of course, I have coached thousands of people individually, on a one-on-one or in a group basis. And so there's a different level of, what kind of interaction we're having. So a lot of those, the bulk of those people are people who are working through my online courses and getting success that way. And then obviously I am a person who, just like everybody else on the planet, has a limited amount of time. and
Yeah.
so I typically have like 10 one-on-one coaching clients at a time. And right now I'm doing like 3 group coaching. And so, yes, I have like 3 groups that I'm coaching, and sort of, it's depended over time. There have been times kind of mid-pandemic when I had 30 one-on-one clients at a time, and I had to recalibrate because I was like, ooh, that's too many. Like,
That
that's too
doesn't
much.
sound pleasant.
No, that's too much. And so I had to start putting limits on it, right? And then I had a cap on how many people I could coach. And then I had a wait list. And then I was like, oh, I need to create a group program because I don't want people to have to wait for help, et cetera. And so yeah, it's just from different modalities of working with folks. And then I'm sure it's more than that too, because I do a lot of corporate workshops and things. So I'll, go into, it just was, talking to a company in Hong Kong last week, and I did a workshop for their team of 1,000 people, right? Virtually. So there's lots of different ways to interact.
That's actually very interesting because, at least from what I see about that part of the world, it's way more stressed out than us. At least they get worked a lot harder than us. They would wish for a 37-hour work week, which is the standard here in Denmark.
Yeah.
How do you go about helping like a completely different culture or
Well,
something?
first you have to understand the culture and you have to ask a lot of questions, right? And so, for that workshop that I was doing for that team, we went through kind of, here's what I think we picked a topic around like task management, planning, prioritization. And, I said, here's what I typically present, but let's go through this and make sure that there's nothing that I am saying that goes against your culture, right? And 2, that like, let's reinforce, if there's anything that you want me to reinforce because these are your standards and norms, let's do that. And so, it was interesting. There weren't that many things that we needed to change, but there was some stuff. Like, I remember specifically, I talk about kind of under promise, over deliver, from a perspective of timelines, et cetera. It's like, we know that there is always going to be things are always going to take longer than we want. There's always going to be emergencies that pop up. And so instead of giving people the best case scenario timeline, let's give a timeline with a little bit of a buffer so that if something does happen or take longer, which it probably will, we're still being accountable, right? And they said, that's not going to work with our culture because we like the way that we work. Like, we just can't tell people to like pad it, right? And so I said, okay, like we talked about it a little bit, and we were like, you know what, then we're just going to leave that out because that's not something that goes along with your culture. And so I think it's about finding that, like, what we can adapt things to, and what is going to work within both their kind of country culture and also the organizational culture of their company.
Yeah, good point. All companies have different cultures as well,
Right.
and I wonder if they're just always on time. So it's not a
We
problem. We don't have to recalibrate. We're on time anyway.
I mean, maybe, or maybe it's that just didn't sit well with them around, like they maybe they're concerned that their leaders would not like that, or who knows, right? But I think that the goal is not, again, like, just like all people are different, all companies are different, and so we want to say, what are some things that work well for most people, and then want to empower people to be able to iterate from there to make it really work for them.
I'm going like maybe a bit deeper with that question as well. Is how was it like different working with a culture that seems that much more productive? I've never been, so I can't really speak for it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, like, you're bringing this up now, but this is not something that I was thinking about, right? Because I don't know, like, being productive and working long hours are not necessarily the same thing, right? There are so many studies that show that we actually have diminishing returns after 50 hours of work, right? People who are working 70 hours a week are no more productive than people who are working 50 hours a week. And I actually don't know what for this company, the specific company that we're talking about, I don't know what the hours are that people are working, or I don't know exactly what their productivity output is. Their goals were to provide people with tools to make their workload less stressful and to stay on top of things more without that stress, and to be able to get things done. But it is a culture, for whatever reason, for that company where, a lot of people did have to kind of be always on, always responsive. And that's not, in a lot of places, that's not something that they need to do. And so we can then use different tactics, right? And so I think, like, I don't know that they're more productive, right? They just have a different way of doing things.
Yeah, productivity is also a very very hard thing to measure.
Yeah, productivity, the whole concept of productivity, right, comes from a factory setting where it was really easy to say, oh, we're producing 600 widgets an hour, and if we make this tweak, we can get it up to 603 widgets an hour. And that is something that is very easy to see the impacts of the interventions, and et cetera. And you're totally right. Most people these days work in a knowledge economy, and that is much harder to measure because the outputs are very difficult to measure. And I think that productivity itself, like, the definition that people would probably use for a lot of people use for productivity is like doing the most amount of stuff in the shortest amount of time, or something like that. And I really think of productivity as doing what you intended to do. So you are productive if you do what you intended to do, right? And built into that is that I can be productive if what I decided to do was sit in my hammock and read a novel, because I intended to do that. That's how I wanted to spend that time. I meant to do that. I am also productive if I have a whole bunch of things I'm trying to get done in my business today, and I was realistic about the amount of time that those things would take me, and I got those things done. That's also productive, right? And if I am not realistic about it, then that's an opportunity for me to tweak, to be able to get more realistic in the future about it. Because, I really like to use this concept I call task realism, which is that, let's just simplify it. If you have time to get 5 things done tomorrow, is it going to be better to have the right 5 things on your task list for tomorrow, or to have 25 things on your task list for tomorrow? Because even if you get the same 5 things done, in the first scenario, you feel really good about yourself. And in the second scenario, you feel really bad about yourself. But it was the same result.
Yeah. A lot of people, to some extent, also including myself, get caught up in busy work, bad busy work.
Mm-hmm.
You're just throwing a bunch of stuff on the task list, as you spoke about, not all of them very necessary at all.
Yeah.
And then you weren't really productive. You got stuff done, but you're just spinning around.
Right. Right. Busy
And
and
you
productive are not the same thing, right?
Not at all, not at all. And you're
Yeah.
kind of just like a hamster running around in a hamster wheel, and unless that
Right.
hamster is connected to a socket and produces electricity, it's not really productive.
Right.
It's
Right.
just running in circles, doing nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is actually why it's not enough just to get out, here's a list of all the things that I have to do. It's actually really important to plan, right? And sometimes people say, well, why should I bother planning? Because there's so many fires that need to be fought that, maybe I make a plan and then my plan never goes as planned. And following the plan exactly is not actually the point of the plan, right? The plan is there to help make sure that we're spending our precious resource of time on the things that are going to move the needle, right? So that if you have a plan and you say, these are the things I really need to get done today, these are the most important things. If there's incoming items or busy work or your email inbox or whatever, now you can evaluate that against the plan. You can say, oh, is this thing worthy of shifting my plan? If so, great. You get to feel good about those decisions. But if not, you can also push back on that thing or not do it in the case of busy work and also still feel good about that.
Yeah. I like to have like my next couple of days pretty filled out so I know
Mhm.
what to actually get done. And like we talked about at the start, that comes as much down to knowing myself. And
Mhm.
that's the way I get the most output is by
Yeah.
knowing and eliminating that procrastination
Yep.
and thinking about what shall do next. I like in
Yep.
the morning. Oh, well, I have no clue what I did. I slept amazingly. I have absolutely no clue what's going to go on today. And then just being
Yep.
able to pull up my calendar and see, oh, it's this. And then
Yeah.
I,
You and me both. I mean, I think, there's one time a few years ago, I was at a conference and, they were having us do some kind of like exercise in the seating hall where we're watching. And the thing that they asked us to do was like, okay, turn to the person next to you and tell them all the things that you have to do today or tomorrow. And then the idea of this exercise was that then you would tell them and you would switch the words and you would say, well, no, these are the things that I get to do today. And that was not the point of it for me because I turned to this person and I said, I have no idea what I'm doing tomorrow. I just know that it's all planned and it's on my calendar and that when I show up to tomorrow, it'll be there and I'll do it. Right.
yeah, yeah, I'll probably check 3 times. Oh, I have a podcast with Alexis today. Then 2 days, oh, yeah, I have a podcast. And
Yeah.
that kind of goes on like a couple of weeks before. Because it's my brain uses the energy for something else it finds more
Yeah.
important than remember every single task and when it gets done and what day and all of
Right.
that. I have my
And
calendar for that.
yeah, and that's like for me, that's what a task system does. Like if our shoes were switched and for my podcast, if I'm interviewing someone, right? Um, I have the podcast date that we're scheduling, but I also have time a few days before that's blocked to really like what are the questions and what is the prep I need to do for this thing, which means I don't have to think about it at all until that pops up, right?
Yeah. Uh, I need to do that same thing because I do the questions before and like prep my
Mm,
head and how do we structure it. But it is that thing of, oh, did I get that done or
yeah.
am I still supposed to do it?
Right. Right.
The structure's kind of been tested out in a bunch of different ways. And because we
Right.
schedule far into the future, then sometimes an
Yep.
old podcast comes up where I've done no prep and I'm like, ooh,
Right, right. Yeah, and so I think that's the value of using a task system, right? Is that you can assign things out into the future. I mean, it's like in my task system, I have our passport expires every 10 years, right? So I have a recurring task that occurs 9 years after, right? It's like 9 years out. It occurs 1 year before my passport expires that says, oh, now's the time you need to start thinking about getting your passport or my driver's license or whatever, all of these things because I don't want to have to be laying in bed randomly 7 years before my passport expires thinking, when does my passport expire? Right. And I mean, it's a silly kind of example, but we're doing that all the time with all sorts of things. And if we have a trusted system, we can kind of offload that. It's like you have an external hard drive for your brain.
yeah. Well, the bed is the best place to remember all of the stuff you're supposed to get done.
Right.
When you're
And that you
laying
can't
there,
do right now. Yeah.
yeah, so I'm not gonna get my clothes on, do this little one thing, and then go back.
Right.
So, because I know what's gonna happen if I do that. Then
Right.
I'm gonna go back to bed 5 minutes after the same thing is gonna happen, and
Yeah.
then that's gonna be all night.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
very
Which is
productive
another
night.
which is another reason why doing a brain dump can be really effective, especially for sleep. So there's studies that show that if you do that brain dump that we were talking about at the beginning, just doing that before you go to bed can actually help you fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer because you're not having these kind of circling open loop thoughts that prevent us, those kind of racing thoughts often prevent us from sleeping.
Hmm. Um, I don't have many sleep problems, but I
Good for
might
you.
still.
Yeah.
I still might try it. Still might try it. I'm quite good at well, being able to sleep when I'm supposed to
Yeah.
sleep. Uh,
Good.
I think it's like finding just the right place to push yourself, extend yourself, and then you kind of more naturally fall asleep. And it's also once you set up your task list and you completed all of the tasks you set out to do, you feel good, you go to bed, you feel amazing, you just fall asleep very easy. So
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I would say I feel like you're making this sound a lot easier than it is for a lot of people, right? Because I think
I'm
it's
lucky,
not
man.
yeah, I think it's not that easy for a lot of people. I think this is something that, at least in my practice, people really struggle with, even if they have, I mean, because the reality is what you've described is you do the task list and then you did all the things and then you can sleep. Most people are not calibrating to that level. It takes a while to learn how to calibrate to one track all the things, right? Make sure that there aren't little errant random things that you're not keeping track of, and then two, to calibrate it to really plan for the time that you actually have instead of the time that you wish you had. And I think a lot of people are using a task list, not a task system, right? And the list never ends. But if you're kind of adding date-based prioritization into this, now it becomes a system where you can say, okay, yeah, I don't, you know what, I sent that thing off to this person, but I don't need to think about it until next week. So I add a next action for next week of follow up with them if they haven't got back to me already. And like really, a lot of people are bad at time estimation, right? And
Uh,
so like there's a lot of things that go into it. I think that I just don't want to give people the impression that it's like, oh, it's so easy to just, because sometimes this stuff is really hard.
oh, well, the sleep side part, I do want to
Yeah.
underline I'm the type of guy when I wake up the next day and you ask me, did you hear the thunderstorm? I'll say,
Mm,
what thunderstorm?
right. You're a
Because I
deep
was
sleep.
fast.
Yeah.
Nothing happened. What storm? Um,
Yeah. You're a deep
it needs to
sleeper.
be
Yeah.
really, really, really bad for me to
Yeah.
wake up. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, some of the times when they're doing road works in front of my
Yeah.
window, I still sleep through it.
Yeah.
But for the people that want to get a deeper understanding of how to get the right type of stress because they don't want to
Hmm.
get rid of it,
Yeah.
what would be a natural next step, and how also can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so I think that the right step for like figuring out what level of stress is right for you is I would just ask yourself, do a little self-reflection. Like, do I feel stressed every day, all day? Is this preventing me from enjoying other things in my life? Do I feel like I only have time for work and not time for other things? Or do I feel kind of like okay about my time allocation, right? I think that's a first step to start. And then I think if you're falling into the camp that probably most people who are listening to this are, where they feel like maybe they're a little more stressed than they would like to be, it's affecting their life a little bit more than they would want it to be. I would take a look at what obligations do you have that you might be able to get rid of, right? So, are there things that are on your plate right now that for any number of reasons we could not do anymore, right? Maybe there are meetings we could delegate to other people on our team. Maybe we're doing some volunteer work, which used to be really meaningful to us, but isn't anymore because it changed. Maybe there's things we could automate, right? Like, how can we kind of reduce the need for us to be spending all of our time on work so that we have more time for the other parts of our life that have maybe been neglected? And I would start with like one change, just One
I
change,
like that.
right?
I like that a
Just
lot.
one.
Nice and simple.
Yeah, nice and simple. And then where can people find me? So, of course, you can find me on my website, alexishaselberger.com. There's all sorts of free resources there. There's a distraction action plan you can download. But more importantly, I also have a podcast. It's called Do More, Stress Less with Alexis Haselberger. And that is a great place to get introduced to more of these ideas to help you to reduce your stress while maintaining or increasing your productivity.
I'll, of course, make sure those links are down below. So it's
Perfect.
nice and easy, because I'll
Yes.
get very annoyed if people don't do that themselves. I'll be like, lazy bastard, I'm not spelling that in when you're lazy yourself.
Yep.
And
Totally.
thank you very much for coming on the Business Library. I had a great time, learned a bunch about stress, and I hope it was valuable for everybody listening as well.